Have you ever asked the question, who am I if I'm not in ministry anymore? And more importantly, what's next? Today we're talking with Josh Taylor, someone who, like many of us, wore multiple hats in ministry. He was a worship leader, executive pastor, builder of healthy teams. But what do you do and what happens when the calling that once felt so certain starts to shift? And when you sense that season is ending, but you're not exactly sure where it's leading? In this episode, this conversation, Josh shares what it looked like to leave a thriving ministry, not because of conflict or burnout, but because God was stirring something new. He opens up about the tension of knowing you're meant for more while not knowing exactly what that more is, and the fear that comes with leaving a secure role without a clear plan. So if you're in a place where you're feeling the pull to move on, or you're walking with someone who is, Josh's story will give you some insight, some clarity, and most of all, permission to be honest about what you're feeling. Because what Josh learned and what we believe is that ministry doesn't end, it just moves. Well, hey, Josh Taylor, welcome to the Life After Ministry podcast.
Hey, Matt, so good to be here. It's been a long time coming. We've talked about this for a while.
Yes, it is. It's about time. So, hey, we have found ourselves in this fun world called StoryBrand. And so that's our initial connection. But you have a story. Before there was StoryBrand, before there was Donald Miller, you were in vocational ministry. Give us a little sense of your calling in and your calling out.
Yeah, well, the calling in was weird. Probably not that weird for your listeners that are in ministry or have been in ministry. Started when I was in high school. Didn't really know what it meant to go into ministry, what it would look like. I just figured it would be something to do with the only thing that I knew how to do, which at the time was leading worship. And so I graduated high school, felt that call to ministry, ended up at the University of Mobile, got a worship leadership degree. But through that process, really fell in love with teaching and teaching on worship, teaching on different things. And so I sort of had a bent to that and wanted to learn more about that. Got my first real ministry job as a youth minister part-time. Didn't enjoy that a whole lot. It was out in a rural church, and I'm a city boy from New Orleans, and so I just didn't fit really well. And I was basically a square trying to fit into a round hole. And so I stayed there for about, I don't know, maybe almost a year, and ended up back in Mobile and started working with the church plant there, and ended up coming on full-time staff there as a worship leader. Did that for about 2 years. And then the elders there, as the church was growing, there was a really big gap in administration. And so they asked me to take the role of executive pastor, and did that for almost 10 years at that church. So I was on staff there for a total of almost 12 years. And a great experience. Loved it. Got to go to work every day with my best friends. The lead pastor was and still is one of my closest friends. And 2017 2018 was when I officially resigned and stepped into a new season of life.
So going into the executive pastor season, did you ever have to make staff adjustments, let people go?
Oh, yeah.
How did those go well as intended, or did they fall apart?
So there were some staff adjustments. We grew as a staff. I was the second, other than our lead pastor. So technically, I was the first full-time staff member to come on board outside of our lead pastor, and then we grew from there. I can't remember by the time we left how many full-time we had. Maybe it was 17 or something like that. And then we had a lot of interns and part-time people working with us as well. The church grew significantly over those 12 years. And so, there was a lot of staff hires, and there was not a lot of turnover. In fact, the guys that are still on staff there, most of them have been on staff there in some capacity since when I started. So they've, that church did not have a lot of turnover. We did have to let a couple of people go, and a couple of those turned out really, really well. In fact, so well that they even stayed at the church until they were called to either another ministry, or one of them actually went on the mission field overseas. It was a pretty healthy church. There was one situation that I let somebody go, and it was probably not handled the best by either myself or by him. It was a pretty abrupt thing, but looking back on it now, I mean, I was young and I was learning these things as I was going. And a lot of times, as a lot of people probably know, especially with the church plant, you're kind of building the plane while you're flying it. And so it's on the job training. And a lot of the stuff they don't teach you in seminary, a lot of the real world things that you encounter, and even these, professional relationships that you have in the church, how do you navigate those? And so, yeah, there was a lot of that, and I got to learn sometimes the hard way, but also got to see some really healthy ways to do both, letting people go and hiring people.
So do you feel like when you resigned, did you feel like you were being called into something else or just called out of frontline ministry at the time?
That's a great question, and I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure what the answer of that would be. I know what I felt. And I knew probably 2 years before I resigned, I knew that my time either in ministry or at that church was coming to an end. And it wasn't because there was anything wrong with the church. It was more like I began to feel like I've done everything I need to do here, and maybe even everything that I can do here. The church was growing; it was thriving. A lot of great things were happening. We were making a huge impact in the community. And again, we had a really healthy staff. I was working every day with my best friends, and it was a lot of fun. And I remember 2 years prior to me resigning, starting to feel that feeling, and but didn't know. I mean, it's scary because what am I going to do? I have a theology degree, and I have a master's in theology. So what am I going to do with that if not in ministry? So I assumed it would look like ministry somewhere else. But I loved where I was. I loved the people that I worked with every day. I was good at my job, and it was comfortable. And so thinking about leaving that was very scary, and ultimately took me 2 years to come to that point. When it became clear, when I first started having those feelings, I talked to my wife about it, and she kind of felt the same way about me. Was, ooh, I really like the security. That's really scary. Probably her more than me is not a big fan of change, and so I knew, okay, she's not quite on board with this yet. So didn't bring it up for a little while, and then almost 2 years later is when I really started to feel it pretty strongly, and that came in the form of boredom. It came in the form of frustration, probably frustrated about things that I shouldn't have been frustrated with. It came in the form of tense relationships with people that I was once had a good connection with, and frustration on their end, frustration on my end with them, and just overwhelm and exhaustion and burnout. But looking at it and feeling like there's no reason, like I don't know why I feel this way. And I think at the end of the day, it was because I knew I was delaying the inevitable, and I didn't want that change because it was scary. But I also knew, to answer your question, maybe somewhat, I had this entrepreneurial itch. I knew I wanted to build something. I thought maybe I'm going to go plant a church, or maybe I'll start a business, or help somebody start a business. I didn't know what it would look like, but I knew I had this entrepreneurial itch, and I really wanted to build something from scratch that didn't already exist.
Which is a little scary if you haven't done that before. It's one thing
Yeah,
to start something, but it's another thing to start something that makes money and pays the bills and supports the family.
yeah.
And that's the kind of the gap that I think we wrestle with. If we knew that the money wasn't an issue, it wouldn't be as difficult. So how do you leave well? How do you take care of things from a staff perspective? What steps did you take to start to prepare yourself to make that jump?
The first part of what you just said was very true, and something that I had thought about. And so I didn't leave with nothing, with the next step not in place. I don't know necessarily if it was the right step, and I'll get through showing how maybe it was the right step. It was, a part of the story that led to this thing, led to another thing. But I did seek out. There were the provost from the local university attended our church, knew me well, and had actually offered me a job to come on as the marketing director at the university, to work under the vice president of marketing. And so that was enticing to me. It was a safety net. And he also said, "Hey, I'm totally fine with you building something on the side while you're doing this." So that was a great opportunity, and I thought, okay, maybe this is my way out. And so when I decided to take and accept that role, I had the conversation with our lead pastor, again, who is one of my closest friends, and it was a great conversation over breakfast one morning. He gave me his blessing, and his words were, I felt like this was coming. And as much as I don't want you to leave, I feel like we're holding you back because I do feel like there is more for you to do. And you can't do that here. You're not going to be able to do those things here. And I had been there since I was 23 years old. So at this time, this was 2018. So I don't remember. I'm 41 now, so you guys can do the math if you want to. But this was, I was young when I started there, and so that conversation went really great. We worked on a transition. I think it took maybe almost 2 months to do a full transition because there was a lot of, there was almost 12 years of stuff in my head that had to get out and put somewhere and document somewhere. And so yeah, I mean, it was a really great transition. There was a lot of communication. There was the blessing of the pastor. There was no friction. There was no bad blood or anything like that, which helped a lot. I was not interested in burning those bridges. There was no reason to burn those bridges. Now, when we left, or when I resigned, my wife and I had decided we're not going to go to church there for at least a little while, for two reasons. One, I knew it would be hard for me to be there and not be troubled by the things that they would change, that I would do differently and things like that. So that would be a big distraction for me because that's just hard to watch somebody do things differently than you would for the last 12 years, that something that you helped build. And and then also the person that was going to move into that role, I didn't want them to be looking over their shoulder thinking, what am I doing, what am I thinking, those kind of things. And then for the congregation to not see me in that role, I knew that if I went there immediately afterwards, people would have a hard time not seeing me in the role that I'd been in for almost 12 years, being in front of them every single week for almost 12 years. So it was, I think, a good idea for us to step away. And our plan was, we're going to do this for 6 months. We're going to visit some other churches around because we never really had the chance to do that. That was the church that I was already on staff there by the time we got married. So that was the only church that we knew as a married couple together. So we visited a few churches in the city. We landed at one that we actually both attended while we were in college. And I even remember having lunch with the senior pastor there and told him, hey, we're just here for a season. We're probably going to go back to the church I was on staff at. And he was totally fine with that. He said, look, we're glad to have you as long as you're here. And we want to support you in this journey because we know this is new for you. And we ended up staying there for almost 4 years. So we actually found a home there and a place there. And I got to actually be a part of the teaching team, meeting every week with their pastors to help plan the sermons and get different perspectives on the sermon, and even got to preach a little bit while we were there.
So you were open to jumping in, being part of the community. My wife and I were at a wedding this weekend, and we talked to the officiating pastor afterwards, and he has a little church plant and invited us to come by. And I said, as long as you don't ask me to do anything, I just want to sit in the back. I want to come late. I want to leave early. Like, just don't pull me in. But you were open, even in that season, to be able to jump in there.
I was. I mean, there wasn't anything about ministry that I didn't necessarily like. I loved teaching. I loved helping organize things. I love helping solve problems and getting in. And there's a lot of different things that churches need help. They have problems that they need help solving. And, different churches are going to have different problems. And this church was experiencing some growth challenges that we had experienced at the church that I was at. So I had the tools already to help them solve some of these problems. So I'm very much somebody that wants to step in and help. And I wasn't shy to do that. And they were very welcoming, and they even gave me an office to work out of while I was, which that story comes later. But they gave me an office to work out of because I didn't like working from home and being isolated.
So what does it look like now? You're on day one and you're continuing this new journey. Did you take this marketing position? What did you start to build?
Yeah, I took the marketing position. I remember taking a picture on my way to work. That was the first time that I'd had a first day of work in a long time. So I was
Mm.
nervous and I wasn't used to here's what time you got to be here, here's what you got to wear. We had a very fluid, flexible schedule and just culture at the church that I was on staff at. So this was all new to me. And the person that I answered to at the church was our lead pastor, who was very much a delegator. He was very good at knowing what he was good at and hiring people that were good at the things that he was not good at. So he was good at, hey, this is your thing, you run with it, you tell me where you need help. And now moving into a culture that was much more competitive, that was people were much more paranoid about, it was this person going to take my job, or are they trying to get into this role? And so going into that, it was it was a whole different experience. Some of it I loved, some of it I didn't. There was a lot of tension within the marketing department that I worked in, tension that was already there before I got there. And so I was there in that department for about 6 months. I mean, no, probably not even 6 months before I really started to not enjoy that tension that was in there. And so I went to the provost that hired me and said, "Look, I love being here. I love working with you and the little side projects for the school that we get to work on. But if I'm going to stay here, I can't stay in this department. There's just," and he was aware of the tension. And so he actually moved me into a role that worked directly for him. And then I got to do some instructing in the theology department and did that for about the next 6 months. And the president of the university actually ended up getting fired. And that came with the board of trustees kind of taking over leadership. And sometimes, a lot of times, when the board of trustees takes over something like a university, they just start making cuts. And because they didn't understand my title, none of them really knew who I was. I was a part of that cut, which was tough at first. My favorite story from that is the day that I got laid off from that. The provost called me into his office, and again, he's a good friend of mine. He calls me into his office and he immediately starts crying. And he said, "Josh, I did everything that I could to try to save your job, but at the end of the day, they just didn't understand your title and what we were trying to do, and so I've got to let you go." And I remember looking at him and I said, "It's okay. I get it. I understand. It's not your call. It's their call. And it's nothing personal." And they were going to give me to the end of the month, which I think was maybe 2 weeks left. But he said, "If you want to go home and just take the rest of the day, and in fact, if you want to take the next 2 weeks and just work from home and finish out there, that's fine." And so I
How
remember
long had you
leaving.
been there? How long
Not
were
even a
you
year
there by
yet.
that point? Not even a year. So
Almost a
you
year.
made
Not
the
even a
the
year.
jump out of the church job into this one, and the safety net has now been removed.
The safety net is gone, and this was a good safety net. The salary wasn't awesome, but they had the best healthcare you could get. All of the other things that come when the salary is not great when you go to
Right.
work for like an institution like that. And most people go to work there because of the benefits, not the salary. But I remember driving home that day, unsure of what I was going to tell my wife, and didn't know. We'd never been in this position. I'd never been laid off before. And I sat down with her. Our son was young. We sent him to his room for a few minutes. And I remember sitting down with her and just saying, I just got laid off. And I didn't know what she was going to say. And I was actually nervous about what she was going to say. I didn't want her to worry. I didn't want her to get really emotional, those things. And she just looked at me and she said, "That's okay." And I remember this, and I'll try not to get emotional. But I remember her saying to me, and this was the first time that she had said something like this to me in our marriage. She said, "Josh, one, I think this is a good thing because I know that you're meant for more than what you were doing there." And she said,
Mm.
"Not only that, but you are a problem solver and you always figure this out. And I have 100% faith that you're going to make the next right decision." And that's all I needed to hear. And I mean, honestly, it took one of the lowest points of my professional career and turned it into one of the best days of my life. Because hearing that from my wife, when you hear that from your wife, from your spouse, I mean, it just gives you a whole different level of energy and adrenaline that it's like, you know, it was like a shot to the arm. Like that's what I needed to hear, and it motivated me to figure out what I'm really capable of. And it was very similar to the same thing that the pastor had told me that morning that we had breakfast. And I told him that, and he said, "Josh, I don't want you to leave, but I'm giving you my blessing because I know you're meant for more, and you can't do that here." And it was the same thing my wife said to me almost a year later. So that's kind of how that story landed. And so yeah, the safety net is gone, and now I've got to figure out what's next.
Yeah. One thing that you said before was that ministry didn't end, it just moved. Do you
Yeah.
feel like even at the university and then everything that came next for you, did it still feel, and even today, does it still feel like ministry? And how do you take that mindset on?
It does, and there were times where I had to figure that out. You know, what was really hard for me to leave as a pastor is my identity was a pastor, and so I saw myself as nothing else but a pastor first. And so who was I if I wasn't a pastor? If I wasn't the executive pastor of this church? And so there was a lot of pride and arrogance that came along with that train of thought. And so when I left to go to the university, it was a Christian university. I got to teach in the theology department, and I was teaching leadership, and I was teaching future pastors and ministry leaders. So I got to use and see that as ministry from there. And then moving into other roles, I've been able to use my experience as a pastor in some of those roles. Today, there's nothing related to ministry that I do other than the conversations that I get to have with people who I probably would have never had conversations with if I was a pastor. I am the CMO of a marketing agency that works exclusively with car washes. And we have a lot of customers that are not religious at all, or they're other religions, or they're sort of, they go to church, but they don't take their faith really seriously. And we get to have conversations with them. They trust us so much that they're willing to have those conversations with us. And we will even hold events for them. We will always pray before these events. And some of them are completely different religions than us. And they even come back and say, "You guys doing that, we've never seen people in this industry do that." And it sets such a precedent for the rest of this event. It feels different than any other event that we go to because of what you guys do. So they respect that we do it, and we're not unashamed of, putting our faith out there in front of them. And so it's just a whole different kind of ministry that I wouldn't get to do if I was still a pastor.
If we could go back and ask like 2015, Josh Taylor, hey, I see the future, and the future is that you're going to be in marketing at a car wash company, helping car washes, all throughout the country. How does that align? Like, how would you have heard that 10 years ago, and thinking like, is this really what you've called? When your wife is saying, when your friend who's the lead pastor is saying, like, you were meant for more, you could look at this and say, I'm helping car washes, or you can say,
Yeah.
I'm right where I'm supposed to be. How do you tell that story to yourself?
Well, if somebody had told me in 2015, "Josh, we know that you're meant for more than what you're doing now," I'm thinking stages, I'm thinking
Mhm.
big crowds out there, maybe even either preaching or leading worship, something like that. That's what I'm thinking. And then they say, "But here's what more means. You're
Right.
not going to be working full time at a church. You're actually going to go through a series of trying some different career paths, and them not working out. You're going to get laid off a time or two, and then you're going to find yourself as the CMO of a marketing agency that works with car washes all over the country." And I would have thought, well, that doesn't sound like bigger things. And
Right.
probably would have said, I don't want that. And looking back now in 2025, I could have not written a better story. There's things that I wish, wouldn't have happened, but looking back, I'm so glad that they did, because it allowed me to become better. And I would tell you this, I am not the same person I was when I resigned in 2018. And there are parts of who I was even then that I don't really like. I probably wouldn't get along with myself from back
Mm.
then, which I think is a good thing. I hope most of us are can say that. I'm not the same person that I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And but had I not been able to make those transitions, I probably wouldn't be a whole lot different than I was back then. I would probably be maybe a worse version of myself, because I wasn't taking the chances that I believe God was calling me to take. I was stuck in that identity. I was stuck in that security, and afraid of the unknown. But I'm so glad that I jumped into the unknown.
And one of the things, you're likely a fan of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, but one of those pieces in the hero's journey and really how do we find meaning in our life is to make sense of suffering. That
Mhm.
you have to be able to go through some of those valleys and the hard spots of life and make sense. And it feels like, going through a layoff or going through some of the struggle, that God met you in those places and you've come out the other side. And it really
Yeah.
does reframe. Like there is something about it that, man, I wouldn't trade that for anything, but it was not easy to go through in the moment.
No, absolutely. I had this conversation with a friend of mine yesterday who's building his business, and he is in the middle of a divorce right now, and he used the words. He said, "I never thought in my entire life that I would be going through a divorce, that I would be a divorced person." And it was, and just having that conversation with him, I could see how weary and tired and worn out and exhausted he was. And one of the things that I wanted to remind him of was, you know, it's in those times where you grow. It's not in the good times that you grow. It's not the easy times that you grow. It's not the mountaintops. You grow in the valleys. You grow in those hard times. You are refined in those hard times, and that is just God chiseling away everything about you that doesn't look like His Son. And
Mm.
and we have to go through that. And there are seasons we go through all the time that we look back, and hard conversations that we have, layoffs that we have, relationships that have to change. I even had to purge myself of some relationships that were just not good for me in my seasons of growth. And if we don't have those experiences, we don't become the person that God is really shaping us to be.
Yeah. So you're not only a guy who is a CMO, the marketing officer, you're a husband, but you're also one of the roles that you love to play is father, and you
Yeah.
have a boy. And you talk a lot about what does it mean to be present, especially there's a lot more distractions than there were when we were kids, and the opportunity. And it's not just even the distractions for our kids. I think we as parents are probably even more. I've been
Oh my
traveling
God.
with my dad over the last 2 weeks, and he's 76, but he's on his phone just as much as my
My parents
teenagers.
are
I,
the
I
same
come
way.
on,
I'm like, y'all would be getting
right.
on to us all the time, but every time they come over, they're all doing stuff on their phones. I'm like, man, this
That's right.
it's not just us.
Yeah. So how do we do that? How do you embrace that role as dad in being present and getting the phone away, getting the screens away, stopping, knowing when it's time to stop? Because I realized that ministry, I used to blame ministry on my distractions.
Yeah,
And I realized that it wasn't ministry's fault; it's my fault.
yeah.
I'm the issue, as the great poet philosopher Taylor Swift. I'm the problem; it's me.
Right.
And so how do you overcome that? And what does it look like for you today to be intentional as a dad?
Well, I think when we used to have ministry to blame for the distraction, it seemed like a more noble distraction, a more noble mistress that we would often call her. Um, Today, it's the technology, it's the phone, but it's also the work. It's the projects, and I've got to get this done, and I've got to get this done. And one of the decisions that I made early on, with in my son's life, was I did it, and I heard this actually from the lead pastor that I worked for, because he would say this to us: "I want your families to be a priority, because I don't want your children or your spouse to grow up and resent the church
Mm.
because of what the church took away from them, which was their father." Was the same with our business. I don't want my son to resent the business that I work for because it takes me away from him. In fact, I want him to love the business and be grateful for the business and be grateful for the work. But if I'm constantly, every time I tell him, hey, I can't, buddy, right now because I've got to work, or I've got to jump into this meeting, or I've got to work on this project, he begins to resent that work. So I try to, when he's 10 years old, it's not going to be long before he stops saying, hey, Dad, would you come play with me? Hey, Dad, would you go out in the back and throw the ball with me? And I'm not looking forward to that day. And I hope he's different. I hope that day never comes. But I'm not naive enough to believe it won't. And so I remember that, and I think of that, and I say, when he asks me to play, I want to be available to play. Or I want to be able to say, hey, give me 10 minutes, let me wrap this up, and then we'll go out in the back and throw the ball with you. But I don't want to tell him no. Um, I always think about, who do I want my son to be, and who do I want him to become, and how big of a role and responsibility I have in that, and stewarding that. So, that's the reminders that I tell myself. I'm not perfect at it. I'm still learning. Fortunately, I work with a team, and our CEO of our agency he's got 10 kids. And he is a big family man. And if he can do it with 10 kids, I can do it with one kid.
Yeah.
And fortunately, he supports us in traveling with our families, and, taking the day. If I needed to take this afternoon and say, hey, we're going to go to the water park and just spend the time together as a family, he's all for that. In fact, he rewards us for that. So being a part of a culture like that is incredibly helpful as well.
For the leader right now who is on the brink, and they have this sense, this pull, this tug, maybe it's an entrepreneurial spirit, who feels like they were meant for more, but they're scared. They're not exactly sure financially how they're going to pay the bills 3 months from now. They're not exactly sure what to say to their community, their boss, their wife. What do you tell them?
One, I tell them, have that conversation with your spouse, and have that honest conversation. Tell them what you're feeling. I would assume that your spouse is also a believer. And I do feel like when the Lord is calling you to a different season, he is going to align your hearts together. And my wife gives me so much wisdom, and especially in these kinds of things. And so when she says something or warns me against something, I don't take that lightly. So that's where I would begin and see what is the Lord telling you, what is the Lord telling her, and then from there, I don't think anything else matters. If the you know I had to learn very quickly, it doesn't matter what the congregation thinks. If my spouse is here and this is what she's feeling, and I know this is what I'm feeling, and this is what the Lord has put in our hearts, nothing else matters. And so they can either support us and love us, which our community did, or they don't. But at the end of the day, you've got to answer to the Lord. You've got to answer to your family, and you've got to be a good steward. And if the Lord is calling you to step away from where you are, you're not being a good steward of that congregation or that ministry by staying there, because that's not what the Lord is calling you to. And if you know that and you feel that, you've got to start having those more difficult conversations, beginning with your spouse. So I don't know if that's helpful or answers your question.
No, that's good for me too. I love it. I want people to follow you and stalk you and be engaged with what you're doing. You're not just a great marketer and communicator, but you offer a lot of thought leadership in a lot of different areas of life. And I think what you're putting out there on social media is really helpful. And thankfully, the algorithm has decided that I get to see a lot of what you put out there. So how can people stay in touch and follow you with what you're doing?
Yeah, my son teases me. He says, you post everything. But it's on Instagram is primarily where I do things. It's joshtaylor.guide. And would love for you guys to follow me there. That's probably the best way to follow the journey and hear some of my thoughts on different things.
It's good. Josh Taylor, thanks for being on the Life After Ministry podcast, for sharing your thoughts and your story here with us today.
Thanks, Matt. It's been a pleasure and definitely an honor to be a part of it.
So if you've ever felt the nudge to step away from ministry but didn't know exactly what comes next, I hope this conversation gave you some clarity and maybe even some courage along the way. What I loved about Josh's story is it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't messy. It was just real. And even though his next season involved unexpected turns, layoffs, new industries, and eventually leading a marketing agency, what never changed was his heart for people and his belief that God was still at work, even outside the walls of the church. So if you have a story to share, we'd love to hear it. If you feel like you're being called to financially support a pastor or ministry leader in transition, we can help make sure that they get the care that they need. And you might be a decision maker facing the hard decision to transition someone on your team. And if so, we'd be honored to walk with you to do it with grace, unity, and clarity. You can visit ministrytransitions.com to take your next step, whether that's telling your story, giving hope to someone else, or getting help with a decision that's been weighing on your heart. You are not alone, and yes, there is life after ministry.